We're going to win so much, you may even get tired of winning. And you'll say, please, please, it's too much winning. We can't take it anymore. Mr. President, it's too much. And I'll say, no, it isn't. We have to keep winning. We have to win more. We're going to win more.
It's not looking great, guys. Yeah. I mean, obviously I don't have to tell you, Bitcoin's not looking so hot right now. And I really didn't want to make this video. I would have much preferred to make a video saying we've just bounced from these key levels, we're looking strong, getting a post-conference rebound. I had a great time in Amsterdam. Get home and I have to see this. It's a dreary situation to be in, let's be honest. No one's enjoying this, really. No one, as much as there's going to be people that say, oh yeah, of course I anticipated this. Really, I think if you look to a lot of analysts in the space, and this is no excuse, I know I've definitely got a few things wrong this cycle, but I think this cycle has been tremendously different and very difficult to really analyze and not get too muddled in all of the contradicting data. I guess the underperformance we've had relative to equities and commodities has made this feel difficult, but along with that, there's such strong fundamentals of the institutional influence, the billions and billions of dollars pouring in. It's just been a weird one, to be honest. I mean, there are some potential points to a relief bounce here. I definitely do think that we're going to have at least some rally to the upside or just some short-term bounce. I mean, as we look at the short-term older MVRV now, we're pretty much at a point where this is usually where we get a little bit of a mean reversion. So I'm not saying this as if I think Bitcoin is just going to plummet to considerably lower prices. But I think now, even though I have just bought the dip, I think I'm now kind of transitioning away from buy the dip mode, buy the bull market dip mode, into looking for a more macro bottom or a confirmed macro trend direction change for Bitcoin. If we just look at the where the price is now, as I film this, it's around $92,000-ish. We'll go into TradingView in a second. The short-term holder price at 110K. It's just not looking great, guys. If you look at the fear and greed index as well, and again, all of these metrics are great contrarian points to accumulate cheap and discounted BTC throughout a bull cycle. But closing beneath $100,000 convincingly, if we had a few wicks beneath, that's fine, I can look past that. Convincingly beneath six-figure territory, convincingly beneath the 50-week moving average, the 365-day yearly moving average, very similar levels. Looking at the fear and greed index, we can see we've had multiple consecutive days of really low extreme fear. The lowest levels we had since pretty much the bottom we set earlier this year at around $73,000, $74,000 before we bounced to new all-time highs. And prior to that, it was actually in the previous bull market where we had levels as low as we've recently seen. But I think now we need to acknowledge that maybe we're not going to have this big blow off top. And again, I have to hold my hands up. There was definitely some mistakes I made this cycle, potentially believing that we would have a more parabolic move, just looking at the capital rotation required from markets like gold, looking at the huge expansion we had in global M2 money supplies and liquidity and the divergence we had. It seemed just like a matter of time before BTC caught up, but it's not looking great. If we look to the funding rates as well, even if we look on a more short-term basis, as I said, I do anticipate a little bit of a relief bounce, a little bit of a rally in price action, potentially retesting $100,000. And again, I'd love to be proven wrong. And everyone look back and laugh and say, I can't believe Matt turned bearish at the exact lows before we rallied to new highs. I would love for that to be the case. And even though I'm not 100% bearish right now, and again, a lot of people maybe get caught up in that, oh, he's completely bullish, he's completely bearish. For the last couple of months, I've said that there's maybe a 25, 30% chance we don't have this big bullish end to the year, and especially after the October 6th rally we had. Again, for the past few weeks, I've been saying that, I'm 25, 30% likely that, that was the top. There was still a vast majority of my outlook. The base case was that we were going to higher prices, but now the base case for me, over 50%, is pointing towards the fact that we don't set new highs for the foreseeable future. And again, I'd love to be proven wrong, but for the next couple months at least, I really struggle to see us breaking above that $126,000 level, especially considering even as we're breaking through all of these key levels of support, these key psychological levels, and a vast majority of investors now at a loss on their positions, we're still seeing people build leverage long positions. This is the complete opposite of what we'd like to be seeing. We want to be seeing everyone piling into shorts, getting some people angrily revenge shorting the market to provide some short squeeze potential to liquidate those who are betting on further downside. But we're still seeing people longing Bitcoin, which, as I said, is just not what we want to see. If we look at the spent output profit ratio, we're still not seeing people capitulating. Again, not really a good indication that we're going to get a major bounce anytime soon. If we go over to TradingView, what we can see is if I just remove that so it looks like this, it doesn't look great. The yearly candle has just turned red. And as we can see, any single time we've had a red candle in the Bitcoin price action, it's been pretty bearish. It'd be pretty unfortunate to see just 2 years of positive price action. I know everyone's been saying we've not followed this traditional 4-year cycle, and I've definitely kind of shifted my outlook. I did think that the base case, like I said many times, was a big blow off top in Q4, but as we've kind of extended a little bit beyond where we've typically seen bull markets peak, I did kind of transition into thinking a peak in Q1 of 2026 or potentially even Q2 was on the cards, but a red 2025 certainly doesn't look great. And there is even the argument to be made that, of course, Bitcoin now, as I film this, at $92,000, there is the argument to be made that Bitcoin has actually been in a bear market for around a year now. If you look at Bitcoin versus gold, we can see we actually peaked around, 11 months ago to the day as I film this on December 17th, 2024. And since then, we've just been pretty much down only. Even though we set a high in USD valuations on October the 6th, we can see when actually looking versus gold, we're already down 44% in the past 11 months. Looking at the daily chart for Bitcoin, we can see we've definitely entered bear market territory. Traditionally within equity markets, a 20% retracement, but I think for Bitcoin, we're still a relatively small, volatile asset. We're right now down about 27%. But what we can see is if we just add on some key moving averages here, so we can see this one, the 365-day, which is this red one, which has kind of been the defining level, in my mind at least, for when Bitcoin is in a bull or bear cycle, especially as that was providing some confluence around this kind of six-figure territory. And as I said, as we were kind of wicking beneath this and having some relief rallies, I thought maybe that would be the final flush before a big move to the upside. Of course, there'd be some resistance and some sell pressure to reclaim these key moving averages and rally higher. But after that slight rebound, it's again been practically down only for the past few days. And even as I film this, it seems like we're dropping by a few $100s every few minutes. So yeah, it's really not looking great. And everyone that says, I've just been non-stop bearish, again, as I've said, I've made many mistakes. I think most people have throughout their investing and analysis. But I think a key thing to be a decent analyst is to be able to change your kind of outlook and probabilities of outcomes. And on multiple instances already this cycle, I've kind of said that I think we were due a little bit of a cool-off period all the way back here in 2024, just as before we had this long period of choppy consolidation here. The tail end of 2024, again, very similar instance of maybe seeing the writing on the wall that Bitcoin had a bit too much of an extension to the upside, and we may be due a little bit of a cool-off period. And in this most recent video here, just a week or so after we made that all-time high, I didn't necessarily say that the top was in. The premise of this video was, as long as we don't see equities puke and as long as Bitcoin can continue to show some strength, set higher lows and potentially after that higher highs, then I still didn't think that the top was in. But that was on the premise that Bitcoin continued to show some strength. And since then, we haven't continued to show strength, unfortunately. However, like I said, there are some reasons to believe that we are going to get a little bit of a relief rally. And like I said, I'd love to be proven wrong and see Bitcoin rebound from here towards new all-time highs. One thing we can look towards is if we look to the potential of a Bitcoin death cross, which is the 50-day moving average crossing beneath the 200 daily moving average. We can see the previous instances of this happening, which is the green line crossing beneath the orange line. Again, within just a few days, these marked local lows for the Bitcoin price action, happening multiple times on this cycle already. And we've just seen that literally within the past day or two, we've seen the 50-day moving average cross beneath this 200-day. So hopefully, again, this can signify a rebound and a local low in price action. But of course, as much as this is true on a number of occasions, there's always going to be the time where we cross beneath and we don't see it cross back up again for some time. And there are some other reasons that we can have a little bit of hope and some bullish outlook. If we look to the Bitcoin CME chart, which excludes weekend price action essentially and is only open during, traditional US stock market hours, we're actually right on this 365-day moving average. So as I said, I do very much foresee Bitcoin having a relief rally, probably to $100,000, maybe 102 around this region here. And I'm definitely not going to be looking to offload a huge portion of Bitcoin, sell 100%, because again, we haven't seen a huge amount of indications this cycle. I mean, we've barely seen any on-chain data points, macroeconomic, technical points pointing towards a big major cycle peak. And I really value my Bitcoin, very much more so than I value my fiat currency. So because we didn't have any clear and obvious indications that the top was in, I wasn't scaling out with a huge portion of my Bitcoin portfolio. And I'm very comfortable with that. My ultimate long-term goal, as much as I've said, I'm happy to sell some Bitcoin if the conditions are right. The conditions weren't right for me to sell my Bitcoin, so I'm keeping hold of it. If we do see a rebound to here, again, maybe this is a point where we can hopefully see some strength. Maybe this was just a big fake out. We go back and start trending higher. But potentially at this point, it may be worth scaling out of a small portion of Bitcoin, just taking some partial profits if there's anything you need to, pay for within fiat currency. But I think now, as I said, even though I've literally just before I film this video, bought the dip, I think this might be the last dip that I buy until we get a more confirmed trend change on the macro basis, or we see a huge indication of confluence that the Bitcoin market cycle may have bottomed out at the tail end of a Bitcoin bear market. So what happened? Why were we wrong? Why didn't Bitcoin really do as we anticipated this cycle? Well, if we look to potentially, we'll just go back onto Bitcoin Magazine Pro here. If we look to the manufacturing PMI, which again, I'm seeing a lot of people point towards as one of the main reasons that we're going to see a lengthening cycle, because we haven't seen a big, massive increase in output specifically within the US economy. And we can see the correlation between this and the underlying price action of Bitcoin. And if we open this up on the Bitcoin price action chart here on TradingView, we can see that the correlation here is pretty hard to ignore. So again, this really maybe points towards the fact that we are seeing a lengthening cycle. This was just the final flush out, but I'd much rather be able to flip-flop my bias and make a video in a week's time saying I was wrong, I'm bullish again, than hold on to a bullish bias all the way down to $80, $70, $60, $50,000. Who knows how low we go. If we can continue to see the manufacturing PMI start trending to the upside, we see more liquidity being injected into the system. I mean, again, it's something that we've discussed recently. Global M2 on a year-on-year basis has actually been slowing down. While we've still been in a period of expansion, the rate of acceleration to the upside has been slowing, which has coincided with this Bitcoin price action being a little bit more bearish, a little bit more negative. But again, alongside that, we've also seen the US dollar strength index, something we've outlined recently, come up to this level of resistance and start moving to the downside. It's a little bit more obvious on the year-on-year basis. So we've seen for the past few weeks, the US dollar strength index, the DXY, moving strongly to the downside. Now, historically, this has coincided with Bitcoin's most positive periods of price action. And when it's rallying, it coincides with the Bitcoin bear markets. So again, I don't like to come up with excuses, but I feel like you can follow an approach and a strategy that is technically not wrong and still be humbled by, I don't want to say an irrational market, but a market that isn't following the traditional norms that maybe are to be expected. And I know investing isn't easy. You can't expect anything. But Bitcoin being a relatively new asset, we didn't have too many prior cycles to base our analysis off. So when we based our analysis off these, the traditional 4-year cycle, how Bitcoin is becoming more of a macroeconomic asset, looking at the supply and demand economics of the network, we've not seen any telltale signs this cycle that we were overdue a big bear market, that we have definitively topped out. And as I said, this was always a possibility. This is why we work in probabilities and not absolutes and certainties. But how could we maybe have also seen this coming? Well, in hindsight, of course, things are going to seem obvious. But if we look to something like MSTR, we can see this has been a big proxy for Bitcoin. We can see in the previous Bitcoin bull market, this topped out on February the 8th, 2021. And in this cycle, 18th of November, 2024. Now, if we just go back to the Bitcoin chart here, we can see in the previous cycle, as that topped out, it coincided with Bitcoin in this first of this double peak cycle. And again, if you look at Bitcoin priced in gold at the double peak cycle, you can actually see that that first peak was pretty much the same length. So it wasn't really like we set significantly higher highs on this peak. And if you measure Bitcoin versus something like the NASDAQ, this first peak was actually higher than the second double top in price action. So potentially we should have paid more attention to the treasury companies as a proxy for the upcoming Bitcoin price action. If we just go back here, maybe we should have taken into consideration the compounding effect of the supply and demand economics of Bitcoin. Like I said, we were looking to potentially see the value days destroyed really start heating up, or the realized cap hodl waves indicating that there was a huge amount of new capital inflows. And we haven't really seen that this cycle. But the cumulative outflows that we've seen, the cumulative distribution from long-term holders, again, maybe should have been more of an indication, especially when looking at the cumulative whale shadows, that we were maybe getting a little bit overheated, especially given how long this had really been in overheated levels. This is from last week's analysis piece, our long-term holders dumping their Bitcoin. But again, if we look to the percentage of the circulating supply made up by long-term holders that were distributing, again, it wasn't at extreme levels. Everything was kind of pointing towards the fact that Bitcoin was maybe in the latter stages of the bull market, but nothing was really clear and obviously indicating that we were about to enter bear market territory. So if we just look to the previous weekly analysis piece of the bounce or bust title, we can see that as we closed beneath this 365-day moving average, we were starting to get into very cautious territory. But the previous two instances, Bitcoin had bounced, and then the next one, Bitcoin entered a bear market. So we knew that it was a very critical point in price action. I've been discussing the contraction in Bitcoin's volatility for weeks now, and again, we were expecting a larger scale expansion. So we were hoping, of course, that this expansion would be to the upside, but it's looking more and more likely that it's been to the downside. However, again, playing into the fact that we're kind of anticipating a little bit of at least some short-term relief, if we look to the median peak drawdown percentages since setting a new all-time high this cycle, then this would take Bitcoin to around $93,500, just lining up with what we've already seen this cycle, and that's not too far away from where the price action currently is. So I still think that we do have some positive days ahead of us, potentially, even as bad as it feels now, but we have to now acknowledge that the bearish outcome seems to be more probable than the bullish outcome over the coming weeks and months for Bitcoin. But as much as people will say, you know, this has been a terrible bull market, it's just been awful. Realistically, if you look to how Bitcoin has done, I'll just delete all the things I did previously. From the bear cycle lows of the previous cycle, which again, if you were here years ago, all those years ago in late 2022, we were very aggressively accumulating more so around $18,000. It's not like we caught the exact cycle peak, but from those rough lows, Bitcoin has had 700% returns from low to high. And as much as everyone will say, yeah, we've massively underperformed gold, or we've massively underperformed equities, even now at 500%, if we look at the gold chart, which has done exceptionally well from 2022, bottoming out at a very similar time, we can see from low to peak, even though Bitcoin is now 30% down from its all-time high, if you manage to buy the exact bottom of gold as Bitcoin was also bottoming out, you'd have still only made 170% returns. Bitcoin is still outperforming everything. I think, and of course I maybe fell into this trap as well, seeing the bullish fundamentals, seeing the fact that we still almost looked undervalued looking at an on-chain analysis perspective, looking at the macroeconomic picture, maybe anticipating a higher price peak of somewhere between $150,000 to $200,000. Realistically, even now after about 30% retracement, we've still far outpaced practically everything else. Bitcoin has still done very well. It might not feel it right now, but we've still done very well. And the fact that we haven't had this big blow off top probably leads to the fact that Bitcoin isn't going to have a huge drawn out bear cycle as well. As we could see in some of this data here, the amount of distribution that we've seen from long-term holders is nothing short of incredible. The fact that Bitcoin is still holding up at this point, even though we've had this level of sustained distribution from long-term holders, and Bitcoin is still relatively strong in terms of its price action. I feel like if we'd seen this much profit taking from long-term holders in any of the previous cycles, Bitcoin would already be down 50, 60, 70, 80%. So I know it doesn't feel great to hear this now, but all clouds have a silver lining. The fact that we've already seen this amount of distribution and Bitcoin is still not only down, it's still down less than 30%, does give me some indication that this bear cycle probably isn't going to be as severe as previous ones, almost certainly so. And again, due to the fact that we're seeing more and more passive inflows from institutional investors, we've already seen a huge rotation from whales. If we are to see a downside of 30, 40, 50%, while that'll feel terrible, realistically that still will be a drop in the bucket and considerably less than what we've seen in previous Bitcoin bull cycles. And as I said, in Bitcoin terms, I've not lost any Bitcoin. I'm still holding the same Bitcoin I had previously. Obviously, I'd have loved to take profit with more of my stack towards those cycle peaks so I could accumulate more. But I don't think this is a terrible place to be in right now. I know it doesn't feel great, but I do think we are going to see a little bit of a rebound. But after that, if we are to see a little bit more of a prolonged bear market, then I think somewhere around $70,000 would be a fairly good area to be re-entering the market. We can see this aligns with the Bitcoin electrical production cost. And at that point, think of how fearful and capitulatory, is that a word, the markets are right now. Imagine if Bitcoin had dropped beneath, if and when Bitcoin drops beneath the average accumulation price for MSTI, which is around $74,000, $75,000, which also coincides roughly with the average accumulation price of the ETFs. At that point, that is going to be a true capitulation event for BTC. And if we go back to TradingView, that might only require a retracement of 40%, which if we look to the previous cycles where we were seeing, if I just go to this article here, where we were seeing, 80, nearly 90% and well over 75, 80% Bitcoin bear markets, a 40% retracement would honestly be fairly great in the grand macro scheme of things, especially when you look at equities, which, routinely have 20, 30, and in great big recessions, 40% retracements. Bitcoin would be on par with these huge macroeconomic traditional finance assets, but still have the potential to provide these massive outsized returns. So, yeah, as I said, this wasn't a video I wanted to be making. This wasn't the enjoyable, look how great Bitcoin's rebounded, look at the amazing conference we had. It's a humbling market to be in right now. Everyone's in the same boat. But yeah, it's just the reality of where we are right now. So just to unfortunately summarize, which has probably been the least enjoyable video I've made in a long time, I've still enjoyed it. I still love doing this. I still love Bitcoin. Nothing has changed from a fundamental perspective. Realistically, we probably all focus on the short-term price action a little bit too much, but realistically, that is what drives the huge amount of interest in the space. And the fact that we've broken beneath the key technical levels, the 50-week, 365-day moving averages, that big psychological value of $100,000, has changed my probabilistic outlook for the coming months for Bitcoin into a way that I think there's over a 50% chance that the peak is in for at least the foreseeable future. Maybe we see a cycle more akin to the 2013 double peak cycle, where we only see a 3, 4, 5, 6 month or so Bitcoin bear market, which is maybe only 30, 40% to the downside. And from that point, we can set a solid foundation to build a secondary peak, which is considerably higher. Maybe we see something like that. This Bitcoin bull market has been very unpredictable, not quite as satisfying as the previous ones. So it only makes sense if the Bitcoin bear cycle, everyone's waiting for, all of these bear cycle low metrics to start flashing. And we don't get that low. Everyone starts front running that. And suddenly it's even more unpredictable, but to the downside. Something like that would feel like a very difficult bear market to call, but I'm looking forward to the challenge of doing so. And I feel like not giving the majority of participants the opportunity to accumulate at these traditional bear cycle lows would, again, be pretty fitting for what we've seen in the Bitcoin bull market. But as I also said, I would love to be proven wrong here. If I can make a video next week with everyone laughing at me and saying, look at that, we rebounded, we're already above 100,000 again, retesting some solid moving averages as support and potentially approaching some key levels like short-term holder realized price, those moving averages slightly higher than that, to retest them, to reclaim them, to build a foundation to move higher, that'd be great. But until we actually see this macro trend directional change and confirmation, I'm definitely more in defensive mode. I've been buying the dip aggressively every single time we've had these opportunities throughout the last few years. But now this is the last dip I'll be buying until, like I said, we get a more clear and obvious confluence looking bear cycle low, or we can change the trend direction a little bit more convincingly. But as I said, I do think that this bear market, if we are in a bear market, will be much more tolerable than the previous ones. I think anywhere towards kind of $70,000, which would be about a 40% retracement, would be an amazing area to pretty aggressively accumulate BTC. But I do think it's time to reassess our approach to capitalize going forward. I think the next video I'm going to make is going to be more in-depth looking at this, how I'm going to know when we have more of a confirmed macro directional trend change in Bitcoin, or if we do see a more confirmed bear cycle low. But as I said, it's just not looking great, guys. It's been a fun time. Maybe the bull market was all the friends we made along the way. And I know this probably wasn't the most fun video to watch. It was, as I said, it was still fun to make. But if you would like to leave some comments and feedback, let me know your thoughts below. Again, if you were relying on me to call the exact macro bull market peak, and I didn't obviously, then apologies. As I've always said, it's better to react than to predict. And maybe we didn't react quite right this time. This is why we need to reassess. We need to look to why this cycle played out very differently. And of course, it's a learning process. We need to look to what we can do differently in the next cycle to try and play it even better. But as I said, sometimes you can have the right approach. Sometimes you can follow the strategic steps and still be wrong. But that's okay. Bitcoin has still done very well. If you've even loosely followed the accumulation videos we made throughout the bull cycle, hopefully you were buying at those bull market dips. Hopefully you were buying at considerably lower prices than we were at today, and you've still outperformed practically every other market. And even now, we're only down 25, 30%. I'm happy to endure a 20, 30% drawdown, considering the fact that we got to experience a 500% plus run up in the Bitcoin price action. So yeah, I don't even know how to outro this video, because I don't want to say, thank you all very much for watching. Of course, I do appreciate you all coming and watching these videos, but yeah, it's not the most exciting time to be in Bitcoin right now. I'm not even sure what content to make going forward. Before, if we had dips like this, it was pretty reliably to say, how do we accumulate this dip? What are the next resistance and support levels we should be watching? But given the fact we've broken beneath pretty much all of the big key psychological bull market levels, I don't want to make content saying this is where we need to be selling, this is where we need to be shorting the market to buy, because I love Bitcoin. I'm long Bitcoin. As I've said, I'm very thankful, and it's a great relief that I've not lost any Bitcoin this cycle. Maybe I've not gained as much as I wanted to because I didn't take as profit to accumulate as aggressively as I'd have ideally liked, but I'm still in Bitcoin for the indefinite foreseeable future. Nothing has changed from a fundamental perspective. As I said, from a fundamental perspective, maybe things haven't ever looked as strong. We've got a more distributed network right now, given the fact that a huge concentration of Bitcoin that was held by OGs has been distributed. And I think loads of people have referenced it, but there was an article by Jordi Visser on this being Bitcoin's IPO moment, where Bitcoin is lagging behind other markets. But the fact that we are seeing this distribution from those that were taking the risk and scaling and rotating into Bitcoin as we were still in our infancy, and now we've overcome that threshold, we've become a legitimate asset that isn't just a flash in the pan, that is going to be here indefinitely. And we've now seen this maturity in Bitcoin is good long term. But I feel like I'm rambling. As I said, hopefully you've managed to at least partially succeed in terms of your investing goals and outlooks and analysis this cycle. Hopefully you've learned something along the way to potentially capitalize and take advantage throughout whatever the next few weeks and months bring for the Bitcoin price action. And I'm going to still be making content because I love doing this. This is a hobby for me and I get to do it every single day. And even though it's not as fun and enjoyable and exciting right now, it's a win-win. I now get the opportunity to accumulate Bitcoin at a lower price, more Bitcoin than I would have been able to do so if price was rallying. But if we do rally, then I get to potentially take some Bitcoin, take some profit on Bitcoin at a higher price, and I can also, again, see my fiat equivalent, which I don't care about as much. I sincerely have the goal of just accumulating more net Bitcoin. If I can do that, then as I said, it's a win-win. As always, thank you all very much for watching. Leave your thoughts in the comment section below and on social media. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.